I've got 7 o'clock on the dot, and so I would like to welcome everybody out there to our most recent episode of Keylogger Engagements. I'm James Micciche, along with my normal 2 co-hosts, Kevin Schadlow and Kyle Starren, and we are honored today to be welcoming Dr. Nadia Schadlow to our Keylogger Engagements. Dr. Schadlow is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. She was most recently the U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategy, and prior to joining the National Security Council, she was a senior program officer in the International Security and Foreign Policy Program of the Smith Richardson Foundation. And most importantly, her 2017 book, not most importantly, but a very important fact to us, her 2017 book, War and the Art of Governance, was featured on the Civil Affairs Association reading list. So we'll be discussing that, as well as some of our additional stuff tonight. Specifically, we're going to talk a lot about tonight about how to take tactical victories, operational victories, and translate those into long-term strategic success. And we'll get into that shortly. As before we continue on, I want to say that we appreciate all the feedback from the last episodes. Based off that, we are going to greatly increase the amount of time dedicated to you all, our audience, to ask questions. So please make sure you're putting questions in that Q&A function. Kevin, which is over there for me, which might be somewhere else for you guys, he will definitely be taking those, and our goal is to get anywhere between 7 to 10 of you guys on screen asking a question. If you can't make it on screen, just note that, and we'll take care of that. Additionally, we really appreciate your recommendations for authors. Please continue sending those to us, and we understand the need for greater diversity, so we are going to keep on trying to find a more diverse set of authors, more diverse set of policy folks, because they're out there that makes this a more broad, in-depth conversation. So without further ado, Dr. Schadlow, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me to do this. It's really a pleasure. I feel a strong affection for the civil affairs community. I spent so much of my life, probably way too long, immersed in the archives that you know, that's all related to civil affairs. So so I definitely feel like it's a second family to me, and I'm really happy to be here and to reconnect with all of you. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you for joining us, and thank you for mentioning Civil Affairs and Civil Affairs Association. If you guys had a chance to see the slideshow, make sure you guys follow us on social media. We have a lot of really great writing contests to get your thoughts out there for everybody out there. It's not just for the Civil Affairs Association, and we'll touch on those later. But without further ado, it is time for the pregame. The pregame will be,
oh no.
it is the pregame of the time. It's where the questions are made up and the points don't matter, to quote it. And to start that off, I will kick it to my 2 guest hosts to start off the pregame session.
Softball for Dr. Shadlow. First off,
you can call me Nadia. How about we just call me Nadia? I think it's easier. It will save time.
Absolutely. What would you say is your quest in all your research and life's work?
Well, my quest probably changes quite a bit, but generally my weekly quest is to try to make progress on the pile of books that's always on my nightstand, you know, anywhere from you know, 5 to 25 grouped into different categories. So I'd pretty much say that that's my recurring quest, is to constantly to actually make progress, so that I can actually say I've read those books, as opposed to stared at them for a long time. And I think it depends intellectually what I'm trying to learn at any given time, you know, trying to read sort of 3 to 5 books on a topic to help me get up to speed, especially when I'm not as familiar with the topic. So right now I'm doing a lot of reading on the intersection of technology and national security, trying to understand how in the past we mobilized as a nation, and just trying to understand a lot of the tech language so that I'm not intimidated by it. And that right now is my quest. I think that question though is from Monty Python, right?
That is 100% correct.
Right.
I will follow it up with, what is your favorite color?
That's easy. It's blue.
So, well, that's a good color. It is incorrect. Your favorite color, according to this sheet, is purple, to align with Civil Affairs Regiment. So we'll give you half credit on that question.
Sorry. Right. Exactly.
Okay, Nadia. So moving on to what is probably going to be the most challenging and difficult question for you this evening.
Yeah.
What is your favorite bar in the world?
Oh, okay. I thought it was going to be my drink. I think I have several favorite bars, but one of my favorites is a small bar called Mahogany Shoals, and it's this perfect New England bar in this sort of on Block Island, Rhode Island, and it's just a perfect kind of little bit rundown, perfect in cold weather, perfect, you know, after a sunny day at the beach where it's a little bit cooler. So it's kind of dark. It's not fancy. It's old school, and it's a great bar. It's a classic bar. So I would say Mahogany Shoals, probably giving them a plug if anyone ever goes there. I also like, you know, I like some of the classic. Well, yeah. So I'll stick with Mahogany Shoals for now. Thanks.
That sounds wonderful, given the weather. You already thought about our next question, which is, what are you drinking tonight?
Oh yeah, so that was the one I thought. Well, I'm drinking now a French 75, which I have to actually thank my dear friend, she's also an expert national security, Samantha Ravitch, but she's also a serious mixologist. You know, she has an unbelievable bar. She collects liqueurs from around the world. And at one point in my career, I needed to have a kind of a drink associated with me. And she quickly came up with the French 75, just thinking it was quite appropriate because it's named after a World War I, right? 75 millimeter French artillery gun, right? I think. And she, so that it's become my signature drink. And it's champagne, gin, and lemon juice, and a little bit of sugar, but I don't use the sugar.
So
it's a fantastic drink. I almost went with the French 75 as well.
Really?
How much World War I factors into your book. And side note, if you get on Amazon or eBay or any site, you can find actual etched shell casings from French 75 howitzers that they used to drink out of in the trenches.
Oh, okay. Well, then I need to do that right away.
So, not side note. I went with a New England Pale Ale called New Normal, given our situation from who knows about.
That's good. That was quick. You know, whoever developed it did that very quickly. What about you, Kevin and James?
So I was hoping to find Southern Pines Brewing Company Man of Law in spirit of all the rule of law
right.
Work that we've talked about specifically in later parts of the book. Instead, I found Voodoo Ranger for 50% off, so I couldn't go wrong with 2 6-packs of Voodoo Ranger for $10.
Well done. Great choice on the French 75. I am the proud father of twin 2-year-old boys during quarantine, so I'm chasing my espresso with a about a 2-year-old Malbec that's going down real nicely. So
great. You probably need something stronger than that, Kevin.
Yeah, or just volume. Volume is good too.
Exactly.
So Kevin, I will ask you this real quick. I know it's off topic, but is it better than the rumfire, gunfire thing that Dr. Johnson had us drink in the first one?
No, it's not. That was fantastic.
All right.
Well, at some point we'll be able to do this all together, right? Get around a table and sit and actually share a drink together.
That is eventually the plan.
Yeah.
So my question now for you, ma'am, is if you had unlimited resources, what would you be drinking? If money was not an object, what would you be drinking?
I mean, I like a really nice, expensive port. So, I mean, that's sort of more of a winter drink, right? And probably in the summer, you know, a beautiful, perfect champagne. But I don't know the exact vintage. But in the summer, I think an expensive champagne that's dry and lovely. And I think in the winter, a very nice port. I'd like to say a really expensive whiskey, but I don't know enough about the single malt whiskeys, nor can I pronounce them with the crazy Scottish names, and so I didn't even want to venture there. So next time you have me back after my next book, that'll be what I will refine. That will be my quest.
Well, as much as I think we'd all like to sit here and talk about our favorite drinks and favorite bars in the world, I think maybe we should give the people what they want and maybe start talking about some of the awesome concepts in this book and others. So I'll sort of kick off the discussion here by asking very simply, like, what compelled you to write this book? And I guess what about the national security environment and the foreign policy climate in 2016-17 made you feel like it was the right time to write this book?
Well, I actually started the book a lot earlier than that, I have to admit, and say it took me a really long time to finish the book. I started the book probably about 10 years before that, because it was initially a dissertation, and it expanded. So initially, at the time, I was actually working at the Pentagon. I was actually a civilian, initially a civilian in the Army, and then I became what was called the Presidential Management Fellowship. They were Presidential Management interns at the time, later fellows. So I was rotating around the Pentagon, different offices, understanding what the different offices did or trying to. And I became interested in kind of the American concept of war. I met people in civil affairs units at the time, serving at the Pentagon, understanding what they did. And I began to ask myself, well, gee, these kinds of missions are consistently a part of the American way of war, but they're still not really accepted or considered as integral to war. And this was way before Iraq and Afghanistan. You know, again, this was really in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so initially I thought, well, gee, I'll focus specifically on the civil affairs community, on the culture, understanding what they do. You know, probably it would have taken me, you know, it wouldn't have taken me 10 years, because over time it just started to expand, and I became more interested in the patterns that I was seeing across American engagements, and beginning to see the same sets of activities that were occurring across these engagements time after time, but also seeing the same kind of lack of institutionalization of these activities after every engagement. And so once I started to see that pattern, I thought, okay, I'm really going to try to do the deep dive in you know, the 15 or so engagements I looked at and interventions. And then once I started, I really couldn't stop, because everyone around me would have killed me, including my family, if I just like left it, you know, having spent so many weekends and nights on this darn book. And then then it was just a dissertation. Turning it into a book was also essential, because after all that work, I thought, okay, I at least have to have a book on the bookshelf to prove what I was doing. Because none of, you know, it's hard. It's a hard thing to explain to friends and family in different fields. You know, why are you doing this? And then Iraq and Afghanistan unfolded, and that's when suddenly it became more popular to look at this. Essentially, my article in 2005, I think, in Parameters, or 2003. I should know 2000 and yeah, I should know that date. That essentially consolidated the ideas that were in my dissertation and my book. And that was when I started to get calls from people, you know, almost in the field, sort of saying, hey, how do you know this? You're describing what we've experienced, what we're experiencing in Iraq and Afghanistan. And, you know, that was really interesting. And it was actually also gratifying, because, you know, I think it hadn't been explained in the way that way before.
So for anyone who's just joining us, we're talking about the book War and the Art of Governance, which covers the U.S. military's handling of governance and military government operations from the Mexico War in the 1840s to Iraq in 2003 and beyond. So my question is, given that the book talks about the centrality of political consolidation solutions to a concept of victory, it still seems like a huge blind spot for policymakers and senior military commanders. And civil affairs seems ideally suited for handling that blind spot. However, it seems that civil affairs is trying to generate or go in the direction of more network development operations. What's the opportunity cost, do you think, to civil affairs by kind of foregoing governance type institutionalization in favor of network development type operations?
Well, I think the book tries to just explain, in terms of history, the pattern of the need to consolidate consolidate the political situation. Essentially, it's war is an extension of politics by other means. It's very Clausewitzian. You use military force, at least in a democracy, to achieve a better political end state. It doesn't say that it's not, you know, so I think we are always going to have that task if we end up using military force, right? This isn't saying it's not a book, it's not an advocacy book, it's not a political book, it's just simply explaining that historically these are tasks that we have traditionally had to do in virtually every engagement. So essentially, I think we will continue to have to do that. I haven't followed specifically the civil affairs, the recent changes in terms of the move toward networking. I mean, obviously technology is a big factor in our ability to work on these political problem sets, right? You're going to have to use technology effectively. Technology affects the nature of politics in countries. It's an instrument to be used, but it's just that, it's an instrument, right? So I think that it would be a shame, again, if we lost a sense of what these enduring features of the American way of war really are. And if we don't want to intervene, you know, hopefully we won't have to intervene in countries. Hopefully we won't find ourselves in a situation where we need to do so again. But if we do, we're going to have to face similar sets of tasks that we have always had to face.
And my second question before I kick it over to James is kind of from as a senior policymaker yourself, what in your mind would you expect the civil affairs regiment to do? Like, what service are you thinking when you kind of think about the strategies of an intervention or any type of operation going forward at a senior level?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, my book is also broader than, it doesn't just cover that, it wasn't just civil affairs units that did these tasks, right? So it's important to understand that these tasks, what I call politics on the ground, and the problems that were presented by these political challenges actually had to be dealt with by a whole range of army forces, right? General purpose forces. But I think civil affairs units can play an especially important role in organizing, bringing together the components, sort of almost a combined arms role, but in a different way in the civil affairs, an element of bringing the experts together to begin the rebuilding or the economic reconstruction that's often necessary in these situations, right? You'll never have enough civil affairs reservists, or frankly, or units, active duty or reservists, or enough expertise in those units as maybe experts working full-time in a particular problem set. But you can play key coordinating leadership roles in these endeavors. And I think that you're well suited to do that because you're also capable of dealing with periods of instability as well, right? This is a persistent problem. So in my book, I talk about I don't know if you had wanted to get into this in the other questions, but I call it the American denial syndrome. So James is going to ask about that, so I'll let him. But I think that there'll always be a role for civil affairs units because of that integration of the understanding of the politics and economics with the security requirements as well.
Talking about the American denial system is the exact seg that we wanted to get over to Cheech. So thank you so much for following the script.
Sure.
No, this was completely a question that the three of us talked about, and this one that I want to know about. So you definitely list right up front, I think it's 5, it might be 6, I'm terribly sorry I didn't get the number right, of reasons that we don't do this. So there's a long-standing history, and I'll add this book is a fantastic history lesson of the United States Army as well, and it really does trace the history of the United States Army from a very much of a like frontier army to an actual expeditionary force. And it's really interesting from a historical standpoint, but you discuss, I think it's 5 or 6 specific reasons why we don't use the U.S. Army specifically, or the DoD, to do these governance tasks, to be able to consolidate gains, which is the new term we use now throughout the doctrine. Do you feel that those 5 have changed since you've written it, or do you feel like they've become even more of a taboo, or it's become less of a taboo over the last 3 to 4 years as we've seen a decrease in actually putting forces forward, a la Syria and other interventions?
Yeah, no, I don't think they've changed. I'll go over them quickly. The first part of this denial syndrome is that we don't like our military to play overtly political roles, right? We're a democracy. Our founding fathers dealt with the problem of how you deal with a standing army. So we're very reluctant to have our military play an overtly political role, even if it's external to the United States. Second, we've always been ambivalent about governing others, right? Sort of an anti-colonialist, certainly an ambivalence about colonialism, Revolutionary War, differentiating ourselves from the British. So we didn't want to be seen as a colonial power. Elihu Root actually tried to create a colonial office. That was actually one of my favorite parts in the research, of finding the archives and of really looking at what they had been talking about at that time when the Department of War was thinking about establishing a colonial office, and rejected that. So that's part of that. Third, we consistently thought civilians could do this from the earliest stages. I think from the Mexican War too, I have a couple of quotes from James Polk about how the civilians need to be doing this in the forefront. And they've never been able to do this because they don't have the operational capacity. We can go into that later. Maybe there are people sort of on this webinar who are from state and AID, and sometimes they are sensitive to that, but I'm happy to talk about that further. I think also fourth, one of the other elements was the idea of the Army's way of war, of winning the battles, right? A very kind of a more tactical approach, even though in some sense it was writing and appreciated Clausewitz on paper. The American way of war and winning those battles and were more important than thinking about some of those strategic political implications. And then finally, fifth, there was a sense that we could win wars quickly and kinetically, with technology, sort of the shock and awe approach to war. You could get in quickly, bomb, leave. So I think that those 5 elements actually still remain. I think they're all pretty prevalent today. I don't think we've still, I think, see the sense that, you know, civilians can do this, at least in terms of discussions, but a consistent lack of an operational capability. You know, there's no operational capability to do this in the midst of war, right? In the midst of conflict. This is different than operating in maybe a failed state environment, a development context. That's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about when you actually have to intervene, stabilize a situation so that you can leave quickly. I think it's also important to recognize that in some of the conflicts that we know best, and the examples where military governance sort of worked best, Germany and Italy and Korea and Japan, it was a very close relationship between the military commander and his civilian expert counterparts, very close relationship. So it wasn't that the military had all the expertise. It was that a system was set up so that there was more of a unity of command structure with the necessary expertise plugged in. So, and that also gives people grief, right? I think I come out pretty strongly for the need for unity of command, and kind of, I'm critical of unity of effort for certain reasons.
No, it definitely resonates well, because I think you trace the lineage of it, and like it's a dichotomization of the roles. And I think as we get to Afghanistan specifically, you speak of the alphabet soup of 8 agencies and all these other ones in there. And if you look back at the other ones, it was really military officers that were having to make the decisions on the ground with minimal guidance from above. Now I'll ask another different question on this is, so if we are trying to make strategic gains, what role does the military, specifically CA, have in advising the policy realm about what are obtainable gains on the battlefield, in terms of trying to figure those out, in terms of bringing governance, in terms of, is it possible to do X? Is it possible to do Y? Is that a role you see CA playing? And is the fact that CA doesn't have on the active side general officers, and then on the reserve side only 2 stars, and I know that's a lot of rank, but at the top levels that's not a large voice in the blob of Washington. Is that part of what's going on there?
I think CA definitely has a role to play in terms of being at the table and understanding the particular culture and circumstances of wherever we are, right? It's also quite specific to where you are, what part of the world, what regions of the world are you operating in, what country are you in, what's the history, the context. So CA definitely has a role to play in that, not the only role, because you also want to bring people in who've spent, 15 years in a particular place and know the ins and outs of the political situation, of the landscape, of the obstacles, challenges, opportunities. So you want to be bringing a whole range of people together, but certainly you want CA at the table, because in the end they're often the implementers, right, of actually what would unfold on the ground, or key parts of that implementation.
Okay, Fantastic, ma'am. And so just to be able to get quicker to the question and answer portion of the program, we'd like to ask you a few questions. Now we're moving away from CA, and we've just talked about strategic gains. We've talked about security strategy. We'd like to move into some more larger strategic roles of the military and the greater United States government apparatus. So for anybody that's not isn't aware, Nadia was a principal in the drafting, or some will say, according to the author of the 2017 NSS. Ma'am, would you like to maybe talk a little bit about the process of the NSS, your role in that, before we get into a few questions before we go to the Q&A section?
Sure, but first I want to show you something. I was hoping that someone would notice because I brought this specifically here. But this is that famous green book. Do you see the green book? When soldiers, civil affairs soldiers become governors. This is it's a classic, kind of a classic history of civil affairs in World War II, and I think you can still get it. And it's a great book. It's an unbelievably interesting compendium of so many of the correspondence between the key individuals in World War II. So
I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I did not know that the School of Governance was there until I started my pipeline in 2013. It's something that not a lot of people know. They know the JAG School's there, UVA's there, Madison,
right.
Monroe, Madison, Jefferson, Monroe, and that is it. It's kind of something that should be talked about more.
Yeah. So yeah, I recommend, if there are two books I recommend, it's this book, which I think you can still probably find somewhere online, and Robert Comer's old book called Bureaucracy at War. And if you read through both of those books, the Comer book is quite small. I think you'll be struck by, you wouldn't know what time they're writing in, essentially. You know, if you gave it to a student today and sort of, whited out the area, the identifying factors, they would think you were writing about a contemporary situation or Iraq and Afghanistan. So I do recommend both of those. But back to the question. Well, the NSS, I mean, lots of people contributed to the national security strategy. I think maybe architect is the better characterization, pulling together the different components, ensuring that the writing was consistent, essentially leading an effort, kind of having a unity of, it was, leading an effort, but clearly ensuring, driving to an end state that we wanted to have it done by December. So for that, you did need to have one person sort of in charge. That strategy doesn't talk that much. It's not my strategy. It's a White House strategy document. It talks about great power competition. It sets forth the idea that the world is a competitive place. That's one of the main themes in the document, that competitions are unfolding in the political, economic, military, and technological realm. But it was informed, elements of it very much by my book and thinking over the years, because you saw these competitions. Civil affairs units see them, the Army saw them all the time on the ground when they're in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in other places all around the world. It's a competition for resources, or a competition for power or influence in a town, in a city, right, all over. So that fundamental idea of competition was one that I had been thinking about for a long time, and was able to sort of characterize in the current national security strategy.
So
happy to say more or answer questions, but yeah.
No, that's a fantastic transition, and I think that one of the a lot of people have said that this is a not a full term, but a more of a half face into military, to more of a realist approach to our national security strategy. With that being said, would you agree with that statement? And some people have written about that and said this is it's not a full turn away from liberal internationalism, but it is definitely adopting a more realist approach to looking at the world. And I think the Defense Department, specifically the Joint Chiefs of Staff, have realized that, and we now have the competition continuum, which realizes the world is an inherent anarchical system, which there's competition and cooperation, and states compete to make themselves better.
Yeah, I would agree. I think terms, political science literature and political scientists and strategists use all different terms, and we spend endless hours arguing about realism and internationalism and political realism. And so, but I think ultimately it's a document that thinks about the nature of power in the international system, that fundamentally power derives from states. Even within international organizations, it's states that have the power in those organizations. It's states that provide the funding, the military forces, the economic resources, and in a sense, even the expertise. And so recognizing the limitations of these institutions does not mean that you that you withdraw from them or abdicate, a responsibility to them if you decide that that's in your interest, but it just means that you understand that they're best suited for certain things, and you might need coalitions of the willing to do other things, right? So I think it just was the document essentially identified states and sovereignty as important elements of power in the international system, and the belief that maybe we had gone too far in the other direction of thinking that our interests could be advanced and protected by these broader multinational organizations, that in fact they in many senses were disadvantaging the United States and our allies and our partners.
So that's once again, you are transitioning for me, Nadia, and I really appreciate that.
Perfect. We didn't even practice this.
No, I know, it's amazing, right? So I would like to transition to our amazing audience who have already queued up some amazing questions. So Kevin, I'll pass it to you as our manager, or at least facilitator of our audience Q&A.
All right, so we finally got some pretty fantastic questions rolling in, Nadia, and I think that's really why everybody
from whose
tuned in.
perspective?
Probably not to hear. Yeah, I think that people probably want to ask their own questions as opposed to listening to us talk for another hour. So the first one I kind of want to throw out there is from a gentleman named Doug Hurst, who can actually ask this question in audio or video, and he's really just asking about the 38 Gulf program and the U.S. Army Civil Affairs Reserve, and sort of what your thoughts are on that. How do we need to improve that, or if you think that's a worthwhile capability for the reserves to have?
I don't know that program. Can you tell me about it?
Yeah, it's a way in which we bring in people with different skill sets from civilian governance. So the idea was, if someone had a background as a mayor of a small town, or a law background, or a judge, or anything with a functional capacity, we would bring them in as a direct commission, so that we could have a cadre of ready-to-go experts that could advise foreign governments in their tasks. So a 38 Gulf team is separated into different functional components, like a rule of law team, a medical team, and this, that, and the other, so we could ready to deploy.
Right.
For,
okay, so yeah. So the tradition, it actually is essentially the traditional way that in World War II and earlier periods in history, civil affairs brought in experts. So I would say that you have to look at it very carefully, and this might upset some people in the audience, but simply because you work in a bank or a financial institution doesn't mean that you're an economist that can understand the difficulty of rebuilding an economy in a particular state, right? And I think a lot of times in the past, you had a little bit of these false analogies. You had a lot of politics that went into who was getting into civil affairs units. So if it actually learns the lessons from the past and some of the failures of that past approach, then I think it's an interesting approach. But you have to understand that often operating at the state level, at the level of governance, nation state level, it's often different from some more of the kind of tactical roles that they might be coming from. So it doesn't mean that you're going to go in and just know how to do that rebuilding at that strategic level. And so what kind of additional training is going on, what kind of preparation is going on, what kind of additional education is going on, all of those things I think would need to be factored in.
I think
hopefully I haven't offended the audience.
No, I think you bring that up really well in the book, and I'm not trying to cut on the questions, but you speak about the need to have regional understanding, contextual understanding. I mean, even going back as far as the Spanish-American War, they were finding Spanish speakers that knew Puerto Rico, Cuba, and maybe Tagalog speakers in the Philippines to be able to get that contextual information. And then I do believe it was in the Mexican-American War, it was to use local institutions to be able to project strategic governance in those areas, to have a contextual understanding. So it's not just the U.S. understanding, it is the local area where we will be operating understanding as well.
Right, exactly.
Okay, from there, I think we'll transition over to Patrick Wesner. Patrick he chimed in pretty early on the Q&A portion, sort of asking for some insight on the military community's reaction, in particular to the focus in your book on governance, when it's a time that it sort of seems like the entire national security, or especially the DoD community, is really focused on lethality and large-scale combat operations. So, Patrick, if you're up, feel free to chime in and ask that question further.
Thank you. I'm calling from Manila, actually, and my drink is coffee this morning. So yeah, just curious what the reaction was to your book from the military. I used it in a course I had at CGSC in 2017, 2018 to challenge what the role of the military was. I work for USAID. Thank you. Over.
Okay. I think had we not been seeing what was unfolding in Iraq and Afghanistan and the problems of the political side of things, there probably would have been a lot more resistance to the book. But I think it was kind of describing what was unfolding in many senses on the ground. I think that there's still, I can't make a sweeping statement. I think there's still a reluctance to think about these, some of the problem sets I described. However, there's also a lot of change, right? We no longer really talk about phase 4. The Joint Staff is developing a very interesting concept of campaigning. The concept of campaigning, the idea that there's there's a political, military, economic element that goes along throughout, and that it all is interwoven and interconnected along the course of a campaign. So I think there's been change. I think, but it's not, not everyone agrees with it. So I can't really, you probably could answer that question better than I, in terms of having taught with the book in a course and to see the pushback and what people have said about it. Again, I think sometimes people conflate or confuse the idea of what the book talks about historically and what has happened with the view that this is what we should be doing, right? The two it's slight, but it's different. I'm just saying that if we find ourselves intervening with military forces, we need to be thinking about that consolidation stage. We need to be thinking about the political stabilization phase. And if we can't think through it, and if we can't see what we're trying to achieve, and it's too complex, then maybe that should give us pause. Right.
Thank you.
So, but I do think it's I think there's a broader appreciation for these problem sets than there used to be, than there were 15 years ago. It's seen as I think there's a broader appreciation, but in some ways you all would know better than I.
That's actually a decent transition into a question from a gentleman named Straus, who we have on the line here in a moment. His question actually harkened me back to the AUMF in 2001, and I think it's going to be really interesting to hear him ask. Straus, I see you're on.
Yep. So I'm in the Pacific, coming out of Indo-PACOM. I've got juice since it's 1:40 and it's too late for coffee, too early for anything else. But my question is, we go back to World War II was the last time we had a declaration of war, and everything since then has been use of force or some other legislation to get us overseas. Does that present a problem for bringing the full capabilities and capacity of the military to bear on this type of problem set? And has that added to the evolution of our way of war to be the not war?
I think it does. I mean, I think it does. But also in the sense that it doesn't. It reduces the sense of obligation that non-military actors have in this, right? That we're all in this together, and so Congress has a role in appropriating the funds and the necessary resources to see this through, so that the American public understands what's at stake as well. So I think it's not just military problem. I think it's a sense that what are the other obligations of the rest of American civil society in this, and in our country as a whole. So I think it's broader than just the military. Awesome. So I agree with you. Yeah, and I think it's probably only going to become more of a problem in a sense as politics becomes so divided, right? To get consensus or a unity that's required is probably going to be harder and harder. Thank you.
Thanks, Straus. Thanks for chiming in with your insightful question. Next up, Nadia, we've got David K. Similar question to one that we've already talked about, but again, sort of talking about the balance between LISCO and lethality with what you clearly define as a necessity of focusing on post-conflict governance in the DoD.
What was the first term?
Large-scale combat operations, interstate.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I've been out of government
speak.
enough, so my sharpness on acronyms has really decreased, right?
You're in good company. You're in good company. We've been working from home for a few months, so.
Yeah.
And we have Marines, so we have to deal with their stuff too.
Yeah, who knows? Yeah. Forget about the Air Force. So large-scale combat operations and the governance-related tasks.
That's correct. We got David K is on the line. I think he'll articulate a little bit better than I did.
Okay.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you very much for speaking with us. So my question is, given that we have limited resources, and the Army or the DoD has a requirement to and a mandate to win in large-scale combat operations, which takes a lot of bandwidth, modernization, readiness, personnel. But then we have this other thing that we're also, if at least based on precedent, we'll likely get tasked to do it, after we win, which is governance. In a perfect world, or as you see it, how would you like to see either the Army or the Department of Defense balance those two requirements? Preparing for large-scale.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Please.
Yeah, you have to. I mean, to me, it's not a balance. It's an integral part. You're not going to have a sustainable political outcome. You're not going to have a sustainable outcome unless you're in a way doing both and planning for both from the start. I don't see that decisive sort of phase one combat, phase two politics. I mean, I think you're going to see the political elements, the negotiations, the thinking about that's going to have to happen, and it always did happen simultaneously. So I think I would kind of maybe politely push back on the premise of the question and go back to, I'm much more in line with look at some of the discussion in the campaigning literature that I think it's JP 3.0 or 3-0. That kind of discussion is something that I think is much more in line with my thinking. If you plan for the political consolidation part and the political outcome part well from the start, I think it doesn't, you're able to leave much sooner, right? You're able to make that transition much sooner if it's thought about from the start. So I think that there isn't that clear-cut distinction between the two phases.
If you wouldn't mind, could I kind of reframe that question, because I don't think I delivered it well. So I'm thinking an Army or a military that's preparing to do this, to do both of these things. So recognizing that we have to plan for both, how would you like to see the Army preparing for that? What would you like to see us doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it is actually related to thinking about standing headquarters that are thinking about this type of planning all the time. And I don't know how, I don't know how expensive that is, right? My sense is it's probably not as expensive as a lot of other things, that it's retaining that expertise, practicing, talking, working with people, understanding kind of where the experts in the rest of the government really are, whether it's for all of the problem sets you might face. So some of it is almost a kind of thinking through that organizational, that structure at that strategic level, at that operational strategic nexus. So you always have that in place instead of assembling kind of a joint task force later, that you're always in that mode of thinking through what that kind of operational headquarters would look like. So it's well integrated. And so it kind of addresses what I just mentioned about that campaigning idea and philosophy is actually reflected in the way that headquarters are thinking and planning and getting ready. Because I think a lot of it is plugging in the right experts into this, into what's required. I don't think you're going to develop, I mean, the Army has some of this expertise, but not all of it, so I think it's identifying where the right people are. but also thinking about, this is very controversial, but thinking about the police training angle of things, like externally, like we've always had to work with other countries' security forces, other countries' police forces in these conflict environments, yet we've really struggled to kind of create that capability and that capacity for a whole bunch of reasons, right? It's still a set of tasks that's completely spread out in our government. In my view, in some ways, a nonsensical way. I mean, it's, so much of it is controlled by the State Department, but then really it's contracted out. So there isn't that capability. Why don't we have that capability internal to our Army? So that would be one specific suggestion. You have already the Army Corps of Engineers, which is incredible and does an actual lot of the rebuilding. So are there ways to, I'm just thinking now off the top of my head, are there ways to kind of replicate elements of that in other parts of the Army for these sets of tasks? But I don't think it's a cost issue as much as an organizational one. But maybe that's naive.
No, that's great. Thank you very much.
But the policing one is one that I truly can't understand why it's so spread out, and why we're relearning and relearning and relearning. So I think that would be a start. And we tried years ago, a bunch of us externally tried to create kind of what a security, what a specialized units might look like, that we're dealing just specifically with the rebuilding and helping to reconstitute other nations' security forces, which makes sense, right? Because the more effective they are, the less we have to be there.
So as someone that's about to go to the Security Forces Assistance Command, I think that's a great thing. But just a note, so what you were describing is the Joint Concept for Integrated Campaigning, JCIC.
I think so, yes.
Yeah, and that is supposedly, so there's a new JP, Joint Publication 3-0, that will be coming out sometime later this summer, maybe in the fall. I don't quote me on the date. And that joint, the JCIC, the JKIC, and specifically the competition continuum is going to be heavily influenced in that. So that's supposed to drive how the joint force sees this new multipolar or non-polar world, as there's been two kind of discussions about it. It's no longer a unipolar world as we go forward. So I just for everybody out there, so it's Joint Doctrine Note 1-19, JCIC, and then the new JP 3-0 will all cover these things. I just had to put my FA-59 hat as a strategist on and plug those joint documents to everybody real quick.
And I'm just going to plug, because he's now a retired Army colonel, but Scott Kendrick, who worked really hard and has played a key role in the articulation of that really important concept. So
I actually believe he is on the call tonight. So
oh, okay. See, I didn't even know that because I can't see Scott. So
And Nadia, I just had a quick follow-up related to David's question. In the book, you have a quote from Tommy Franks before Iraq, speaking to the civilian bureaucracy of, "You'll handle the day after, I'll handle the day of," meaning there's going to be a day of combat and a day of stabilization, completely separated. Do we need to push down this kind of idea of governance lower in our professional military education to lower level officers?
yeah, I think so. And that quote actually illustrates the point I was just trying to make about the need to have the kind of integrated command structure where it wouldn't have been that theme, right? There would have been a continuation because you're still dealing with the effects of combat. You're still dealing with the insecurity essentially, and the need for some force probably as you're transitioning. So I think that quote is exactly what we sort of want the opposite of in terms of our thinking about our operational headquarters and how they're working and who's integrated into them. What would an ideal one look like, given what I argued in the book? I haven't ever been in one, so I'm not actually the right person to think that through, but I do think it would be interesting and even something that your journal might consider, or someone might think about for military review or parameters or some of these publications, and what would be the advantages. And maybe I'm wrong, but my sense is it would be different than what we have now.
All right, going over.
So I just gave someone a good research project. Someone else.
So from there, we I'm sure somebody will volunteer. We've actually got Whitney Waldsmith on the line now, sort of taking it from the macro down to the micro. She's got some questions regarding specific skill sets of CA. that you think would be beneficial in governance operations. So Whitney.
Hey guys. So I guess the question that I asked, it was sort of before we got into the other question. So it's similar to the one about the 38 golf, and also echoes a little bit about what you said just now. But about, without being able to tailor exactly to each specific mission, what skill sets is civil affairs missing as a whole when you talk about, being able to adjust, or looking at the civil affairs force and being a group of people that is adaptable? Like, what is the civil affairs group missing, whether that's in recruiting specific personnel or what they're being trained in or not being trained in during their pipeline? So I asked this because I'm not a civil affairs person by training, but I've been sort of pretending to be one for the last couple of years. And so we've talked about this a lot, like what makes an effective person or an effective organization?
Yeah.
So.
Hi, Whitney. That's a big question. I think what I would do is almost flip it, because I haven't been in the civil affairs community, day to day for a while now. So maybe there's skill sets that are being developed. But what I would do is I would almost go to back to this wonderful book that was written about 15 years ago now by Claire Lockhart and Ashraf Ghani, and it's called Fixing Failed States. And it was one of the first books, a very important book, to describe the importance of helping states govern their own people and provide the basic services of a state effectively to their own people, right? They had been kind of seen for years. You had these big international institutions like the World Bank in these places doing a lot of good, but also somehow often overlooking the fact that there wasn't an infrastructure to pay civil servants, let's say, in a department in a country. So, and they describe sort of 10 key areas of how you have to get a state to start to function again. So I would actually go, and it would be interesting to look at, do the civil affairs skill sets now that you have and the kind of people you have, how would they fit into those 10 key areas? So it's not actually a punt, it's kind of a legitimate something that we could talk about further to say, does your structure, does your expertise, or who you're recruiting, can you help states reconstitute their activities in this domain? What would you need to do? I mean, certainly today, different than the past, you're going to need people who understand technology, right? You're definitely going to need that. You're going to need people who understand how to get telecommunications up and running, elements of critical infrastructure that's in many senses more complex today than in the past because of the cyber elements and everything else. But you'd also probably find some enduring features as well. So getting a payment system up and running for people, understanding what the banking structure of a country needs to be. But I think it would be a kind of an interesting exercise to go back, look at those 10 functions of the state and see how you match up to those functions.
Whitney,
that might also be a good article idea. So,
Whitney,
me, a journal is going to be busy. Sorry.
Oh, no, I cut you off. I'm sorry. That's the terrible thing about Zoom is the lag.
Yeah.
But,
I know, because yeah.
Whitney, can I just ask you, so you said you're doing civil affairs work, not as civil affairs. Could you just elaborate a little bit? What is your MOS, or are you in a partner agency or an action partner?
No, so I'm part of the 97th currently, and I am by MTO, the battalion veterinarian. And so I more or less walked into a meeting at the wrong time and became the SIM OIC and have been that for the last 2.5 years. And so it was, sort of just I think a fun experiment for the first little while, but then I liked it and just stuck with it. And so it's been a cool opportunity to learn a lot of stuff I wouldn't have otherwise, and, do a lot, engage with other people. It's been fun.
As a former battalion SIM OIC, I salute you on that one.
So I think, I think how, to go back specifically, you'd have you'd have power, critical infrastructure, telecommunications, elements of the banking system, but all of those are part of these kind of the 10 key domains of how to get a state up and running. And so I think it would be interesting to match that up. But I don't know, Megan, what do you think? Does that sound reasonable to you, or do you think that you're missing? CA today is missing a key domain of expertise in its thinking?
So ma'am, I guess I would wonder if civil affairs needs more training or needs to be able to specifically provide people who have those skill sets, or if civil affairs needs to focus on training people to recognize what skill sets are necessary in each different situation. It kind of comes down to the function of like, what is civil affairs for, I guess, which is maybe a bigger question than this.
Right. Are they bringing experts together in the right place in the right time in a coordinated, integrated fashion, or does civil affairs itself have to have key experts in certain domains, right? Which kind of goes back to what we started. We talked about this a little bit earlier in the conversation, right?
Yeah, it goes back to the 38 golf question.
Yeah, right.
But yeah,
yeah.
Big question. I appreciate you kind of looking at it from two perspectives.
Yeah. I think given the complexity, I mean, I've had to come down in one way, just seeing how hard it is for the military to retain, in some senses, the level of cyber expertise it needs, right? And being able to have more rotations in and out, that it's going to be hard to develop that all of yourself. So to have the flexibility of bringing in the right people at the right time, which essentially really was the World War II model, right? People were called upon from industry, from finance, from different expertise, and they came in. And this goes back to our discussion about having the right structure to allow them to come in to provide the expertise when it's needed. So.
Well, thanks, Whitney. That was a spirited discussion. From here, Nadia, we'll switch over to Curtis. He's got a question related to the information environment versus engagement. And I think what he's getting at maybe is alliances. So Curtis, I see you're online, so feel free to
Yeah, Kevin. So Nadia, it's a real pleasure to meet you. I'm, I think, the first Marine that you're talking to, so please speak slowly and very clearly so I can understand.
No.
Yeah, I've actually,
I've
heard your name for
Marine.
years. I've heard your name for years. Everyone's told me that I should meet with you, but yeah, I'm a former civil affairs Marine. My question was more around the national security strategy. There was discussion about gray zone, all these activities taking place in the gray zone. I think you kind of alluded to this earlier. The way our threat defines warfare or conflict is a little bit different than us, I think. And I think that's causing some issues. So you read the national security strategy, and I think a lot of people are taking this idea of near peer competition and saying, let's just go back to conventional warfare, because that's what we're good at, and that's what we think the DoD's tasked with doing. But we're missing the importance of civil affairs. And I see us reducing resources, and I see us getting attracted to technology. So, okay, we're going to do all this stuff online, which is great informationally, but it's not necessarily going to help with relationships. So being an author of the NSS, one, do you agree with what I'm saying, or do you think that we really do have it right? And where did we go wrong? How do we fix it?
Yeah. No, I agree with what you're saying, that there's a tendency to think that great power competition, peer competition, doesn't actually, that it's all kinetic, all at that high end of warfare. And a lot of it is and will be, but we're seeing now that there's this broad range of political warfare going on, economic warfare going on, the use of technology in different ways. I mean, I like to talk about it in terms of competition, not always use the term warfare, but it's a competition that's underway, and it's taking place in all of these other domains.
Yep.
And that's where it's played out, right? It's not that it occurs, I mean, in some more like a global sense. It's taking place in domains, in regions of the world, in technological domains such as data and the infrastructure for data. And so it's broken down into all of these different areas where this competition is unfolding, driven by competitors, adversaries, threats. So I think it's very relevant, but it's also relevant to other departments as well, right? So that's part of the problem, that it tends to be just the military and the intelligence communities in our government that think competitively. And other agencies need to think more competitively, and that's something I think we're shifting toward now. I think that's more acceptable to even say, but we're still not there yet, because they don't have the operational capacity yet, really, to kind of then make that happen. But I think we're shifting toward an understanding. But I don't know what you think about that. What do you think, Curtis?
I've got a few more gray hairs than most of the other folks here. So, I joined the military in kind of that post-Vietnam era. And then when we went into Iraq and Afghanistan, we found ourselves relearning all the things that we threw away when we left Vietnam. So my fear is that we're just kind of returned to that same mindset. Counterinsurgency is now a dirty word, which, hey, I get it's a different type of competition, but a lot of the skill sets and experiences that we earned through blood and sweat, I just hate seeing thrown out the window.
Right. Well, I have I have an article coming out in the next issue of the Naval War College Review. Not to be self-referential, but it is exactly on this point where it's in response to a previous article which argued that there is no utility to the concept of hybrid war anymore. And it was a good article, well argued, Don Stoker, colleague, like great, super smart person. But I think in that sense, I disagreed with the argument made by Don and I think Craig Whiteside. And I provided a counterpoint argument. So it would be kind of interesting to see what you think when it's out. I mean, I argued that it was still very relevant because the world is not a black and white place. There is a lot of gray. There's a lot going on. And I think also, as a democracy, we don't like thinking about everything in terms of warfare, but we're able to think about things in terms of competition. And so I think it provides some value too in thinking about the competitive mindset we need in some of these areas.
It's an interesting point, but we do it economically every day. I mean, we're big global competitors in the economy. We just don't like to do it on the military side. All right, I've taken up too much of your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Curtis. We actually have an anonymous question, so I'll try to ask it in the original intent. Talking about DoD's responsibility to plan for post-conflict stabilization versus the role of Department of State. And I guess the larger question then is, at what level, whose responsibility is it to define out the political objectives for a conflict?
Well, it's civilian leaders' responsibility to do that. That's squarely in the role of civilian leaders, and I would say, so civilian leaders. That's, but the actual planning, if it involves a war and the deployment of U.S. forces, then again, I see that as a part of that intervention, a part of war, and that I think it's a DoD lead with the right inputs at the right time, and that means that's a unity of command structure, which then allows us to leave sooner, so the transition to civilians, and preferably to, it's not American civilians, it's the changeover to the country, right? We don't want to be there. That happens faster. It's not a humanitarian intervention where it's purely humanitarian, where there's a natural disaster that takes place. I see this as a part of what war is. And so if we recognize that from the start, it gives us pause. If we find that we can't achieve those political objectives, then what's the point of going in? So, and again, my state, I know it's not a popular argument at the State Department, but that's okay, right? We have an open system. We can disagree. So I'm not winning the argument.
So I'll ask one more question, and then I think we're going to have time for one more. Cheech, if you want to pull up Andy Duhan's question, pull him into the system. My question, it's a fantastic book, and you're obviously right about your own book in terms of you saying that it's just showing how the U.S. has handled governance issues. And one of the fascinating things I found was how different commanders handled it vastly different, from Mexico to Iraq, the second go around, and then even smaller wars like the Dominican Republic in the 1960s. Is there a system or a personality that you thought stood out as one of the best models?
I'm not sure who I would pick as one. That's a good question. I probably should have thought about my answer to that and go back and reread my own book. It's been a while. But I think ultimately, to be successful in that kind of role, you know, it's probably the traditional characteristics often of what make good, you know, military leaders successful overall: a willingness to learn from others, but in this case in particular, right? Because there's so many different types of expertise that you need to integrate into these operations. You have to be very willing to know what you don't know, to bring the right people in to help you. You have to be able to operate at the strategic level and get along with others from other departments and agencies and cajole and bring everyone together. So I think it's some of those, and probably those that style of collaboration is probably even more important in that role, because you also don't forget that you're also working with and collaborating with the people from the country that you're in, right? So you need to be able to work with leaders, political leaders, civil society, all those entities. So I think, and I think you have to very, very much believe sort of in the mission command culture, right? Because you have a lot going on. You have to delegate a lot to your soldiers on the ground. They need to have the authority to meet with local, you know, with civil society groups, with local politicians, with the centers of power in a particular place. But I imagine that those qualities of leadership are probably true across, you know, different military branches as well. But I think in civil affairs, it's especially important in this mission set. But
right,
again, you all would know more because, yeah, do you agree? I mean, you've had experiences in the field with different kinds of leaders. And so, you know, you would have more to say on that in terms of if that assessment is accurate.
Yeah, I think it's back to that whole idea of a continuum of war, and understanding it's all parts of the whole, not a clear phased structure, right, where you can turn off the combat one day and turn on stabilization tomorrow.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. I think we're going to kick it over to Andy for his question.
Let me unmute you. Good evening. Hey, everyone. First, I'm going to say thank you very much for having us tonight. And also, I'm from Spirit of America, so I want to thank you for being part of our advisory board.
Hi, Andy.
But what I kind of wanted to talk about is, where do you see the private sector fitting in as far as assisting the U.S. government, as far as reconstructing governance and governments? Do you think that the private sector and NGOs can bridge that gap with the U.S. government where they're unable to operate? What I mean so is that sometimes in the private sector, we're able to operate within an area of operations for a much longer time period, right? We have a much better understanding of the area, of the people, kind of a knowledge. And sometimes, you know, especially my work, I was a 91st Special Operations Civil Affairs Officer. You know, it's very limited, 6 months here, 6 months there. Where can civil affairs and the military tap into these networks that are there long term? And are we falling short in kind of bridging those gaps and making those relationships?
I think we are probably falling short, but I don't think it's the fault necessarily of the private sector. I think it's government's persistent inability to operate flexibly with the private sector, right? Our government makes it really hard to do that. So I think there are a lot of people very willing in the private sector and the NGO community to help, to be called upon and tapped into when needed. But we've still made it really, really difficult. I'm struck by, again, the Marshall Plan days when you were able to call up your friends, you know, early on. You had individuals like General Clay in Germany, MacArthur in Japan, calling up their friends and saying, hey, can you help me out? You know, they were bringing in experts in education reform and experts in banking. And today you couldn't do that. I think you'd be arrested if you did that, right? You'd probably be arrested. I mean, it's so different. So I think that it essentially, the government has got to make it easier for the private sector to work with it. In that sense, this is a government problem. I think the private sector is there, willing, and in fact, Spirit of America has recognized that, right? Jim Hake founded it, and he saw how much Americans wanted to do. He had to create a nonprofit entity to provide a vehicle so that Americans in the private sector and private individuals could offer their help.
Do you feel that there's ever, you know, when it comes into, you know, asking or looking out to the private sector, that there are some problems within the U.S. military as far as egos or State Department of asking for outside help, admitting that there are some problems where U.S. resources, you know, can't fill a gap or a need, and now you need to look outside of, you know, your own organization?
Probably. I don't have enough direct experience. I think probably you would see that more being in the field. My sense is probably yes, just it's sort of human nature, ego. But I think that probably your generation of leaders probably recognizes that the complexity of these tasks requires, in many cases, specialized expertise that you just don't have. So I think it comes down to probably personalities.
No, I totally agree. And as we talk about the golf program, which I think is like one of the most excellent programs that the civil affairs could do to tap into outside resources, I do see one of the, you know, inner problems that we have, or something that's hindering us, is that kind of getting over that ego, asking somebody from an outside organization or from the reserves to help special operations or vice versa, right? I think we're getting I think we get in front of our own self as far as making progress.
Right. I think I think you're right. We can do better. I remember in the early days of Spirit of America, sort of the bureaucracy and the difficulty of just even being allowed to operate in some of the places you guys operate. So I think we can do better as a government, and there are people that are trying. But we need to get faster, and we need to be more agile, and it's a truism, right? It's trite that I even said that because everyone knows that, but we need to do it. So thank you for the question, and nice to speak with you, Andy.
So once again, to our attendees, thank you so much for an amazing round of questions. I mean, those were far better than we came up with, and we greatly appreciate that. So in closing, we're just gonna have a few more questions for Nadia, and then we're just gonna do a couple of brief announcements, and we'll close it down because we got about 15 minutes left here. And once again, Nadia, thank you so much. And we're talking with Dr. Nadia Schadlow, the author of Art in the
War in the Art of Government.
War in the Art of Government, sorry, and also one of the architects of the 2017 NSS. So my question is, in one of our previous questions, really got down to this, what seemed to be sharp power. And I think sharp power is one of the greatest threats to democratic nations throughout the world. And we had smart power, which was the combination of hard and soft together to be a good thing. Now we have the authoritarians and their smart power. From your perspective, what kind of solutions do we have to deal with this sharp power that really tears apart the fabric of our democracy by utilizing our strengths against us?
Yeah, that's another big question. So, it depends how are you speaking specifically about sort of information operations, information statecraft, or more broadly?
So we can limit it to information operations, because we talked a lot about that last week. But also not just that, but finding instability within anocracies, finding instability in the countries we're competing for, and exploiting that instability to be able to extend strategic aims, as our adversaries really are doing, specifically the 4 and then +1 as well. 2 + 2 + 1, yeah.
I mean, our greatest strength is that we're a great country. We have flaws, but we're open enough to be always working on the flaws, to be improving. We're still a country that people want to come to study, to work. We still have allies and partners. Sometimes those relationships can get contentious, but ultimately that's our greatest strength. But partly what we talked about earlier about the idea of a competitive mindset to create the operational capabilities across these different domains to compete. So it's not just the military thinking that way or just our intelligence community thinking that way, but it's looking at what a modern American embassy needs to look like. What does an embassy need to look like today? What's the right ratio between traditional diplomats and economic commercial service individuals, right? Rethinking some of those elements. The information statecraft domain, I like that term actually that was used in the NSS, and I like it because it's not just a military problem set, it's not just an IC problem set, it's one in which we need civil society out there. The government doesn't own those tech platforms, right? We need to think about why the CCP can use Twitter here, but it's blocked in their country, right? So we need to start thinking about how the private sector gets involved in this as well. So I think, and that's a big question, but those are some of the examples. Look at the domains of competition and the tools we have to bring to bear in them. I mean, on technology sides too, DoD is doing a lot of work to ensure that tech companies that have national security related technologies, are not bought up by our adversaries and competitors. So that's an important first step in this domain. Maybe that's out of the sharp power specifically, but I see it as the whole range of competitive activities unfolding. It's obviously bigger than the civil affairs problem.
No, this is much more of an NSS question. And do you feel that there needs to be a coordinating element for this? Do you feel like as a Fletcher alumni, and we, with the fact we have the United States Information Agency and the Edward Morrow legacy, do you feel like there needs to be a USIA version 2 that comes out to help create a national strategic communications?
Sorry, I'm trying to get a light turned on because I'm slowly fading into darkness, I realize.
Oh, no, I just to retouch on the information operations side or the information statecraft dominance. Do you feel that there needs to be a United States Information Agency version 2.0 to meet this modern paradigm that we have, in which it's not just broadcast and print propaganda like we faced in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s? It is a flat comms in which actors can bypass the national level and go directly to the individual citizens that they know have the ability to propagate information and messaging out.
I don't think we can recreate a U.S. information agency because I think the landscape is so different from what it was then. So again, I know that's not necessarily popular in some circles, but I think it's just not practical. It's just not practical. Again, these platforms are not government platforms; they're owned by the private sector. I think we need to think about new operational concepts on how we use those platforms more effectively, how to get more sort of civilian cores of people out there engaged. I think and actually some people have had some good ideas on this a while ago. David Maxwell, also an old friend, wrote a really interesting piece about this idea of kind of these civilian cores of people that you could deploy on these platforms. I think there's a lot of thinking and a lot going on by, really good centers and experts on how to identify bots, how to at least tell people that an information warfare campaign of some sort is underway. You can convey that information. But I don't think the recreation of a kind of a centralized body at a time of really incredible decentralization in these kinds of operations is going to work. I think we need new operational concepts.
Then you push it back down to, so if a nation is nothing but its population as a strength, then you push it back down to civic education. So
absolutely.
The individual citizens can act as their own ombudsman's office and be able to identify these things and be able to have a resiliency. So if a malign actor like a China or Russia or Iran is pushing information operations, it's easy to identify them then.
Right, and they can be aided. I mean, there's plenty the government or some of these platforms can do, again, to identify what they think are bots out there, different kinds of campaigns underway. That's something an individual citizen probably can't do. But we certainly need to arm individual citizens with better technical capability and also civic knowledge to know that they are part of this. They are part of protecting American interests and protecting American values. And we need to do a much better job at that.
Nadia, thank you so much for your time this evening. We always offer you a chance. We've been grilling you with questions. The audience has been grilling you with questions as well. A chance to ask one of any of us or the audience in general a question if you want to kind of get even at this point.
Let's see. I think, I mean, I've enjoyed the discussion very much. I guess I would say, I would ask sort of your, do you see a growing role for civil affairs into the future within the military? Because again, I haven't been day to day following the debates and the issues as much as you all. So do you see a continuing appreciation for your expertise and what you bring to bear? Or are you kind of, is there still an ongoing debate about this? So I'm not sure who I would direct that to. Maybe just a quick answer by all three of you, but I don't want to ruin your careers either. So yeah, so maybe you're all. Yeah.
I'll jump on that one. The guy with the longest hair. We'll take that one. I see it as kind of going back to the idea. Many of the questions from the audience talked about this was the idea that the Army very much wants to fight a kinetic war in which you just beat the other side and they get their beaten, and then the political stabilization follows from that fact that they're beaten. State Department comes in and we reestablish relationships. And I think the civil affairs community could do a better job of proposing itself as a linchpin for governance type operations to solidify that military consolidation.
Thank you.
So I will go next. And I think that in addition to that, I think the Army in general is very focused on large-scale combat operations. But I was exceptionally happy to see the Chief of Staff of the Army today tweeting out that you should read The Infinite Game. So that made me really happy to see that. But I still think, as Kyle alluded to, there's still this belief that it is a linear construct. And you go from A to B. I also feel like there is definitely a need within the greater Army in general to understand that gray zone, specifically population-centric operations, are how our enemies are going to, or our competitors, I should say, are going to try to usurp our influence in areas. So especially since we've definitely increased our comparative military advantage, specifically in conventional military weapons, and now we're reestablishing that in nuclear platforms, it's going to drive them down to competition below levels of conflict, and that is gray zone, and that is hybrid warfare. And if civil affairs is the key element to understanding that, because it's population-centric operations. And you might not see a G-force out there or a guerrilla force. You will definitely see protesters. You will definitely see media. You will definitely see tweets. And I think civil affairs, in line with information operations and psychological operations, are the day in and day out competition that we'll see. And I don't think a lot of our senior leaders are really understanding that, because they're trying to fight the Battle of 38 Easterling in the first Gulf War.
I'm rereading right now Rupert Smith's book, War Among the People, for a different reason. And it's interesting, but it might be relevant to this conversation as well. Well, thank you.
Kev, it's on you now.
Yeah, I don't know if Kevin was going to comment or.
I think for the past year or so, Cheech, Kyle, and I have been on a group chat talking about just this sort of stuff. And the other thing I want to reiterate is how important or how influential a piece of doctrine like JDN 1-19 has been to us personally, and sort of realizing that this whole thing is not just on a linear continuum. It's definitely more complex than that. It's not black and white. The other thing I definitely would want to talk about maybe in a follow-on segment is just at this sort of dichotomy between lethality and the softer type tasks like governance has trickled all the way down to the team level in civil affairs. And there's an ongoing debate on, how much should we focus on the shoot, move, communicate, as they're called, tasks, and how much should we focus on actually understanding the political, historical, and social context of an environment. That's something we talk about, honestly, probably every single day, the three of us. So interesting stuff.
So, Nadia, thank you again for your time and your amazing discussion tonight. I got a ton out of it. I know the other three gentlemen. And now for the obligatory post-talk comments. So just to let everybody know,
I thought that was the post-talk comment.
Oh no, this is the completely hyping the Civil Affairs Association.
Okay, good.
So just a reminder.
You're off the hook now.
Now, if you're off the hook, you're good to go, ma'am.
Yeah.
So just to remind everybody that this is sponsored by both the Civil Affairs Association and Civil Solutions Incorporated. So just make sure you visit those ones. We'd also say if you're a civil affairs officer, NCO, or even someone that has experience with them, take a look at the Civil Affairs Association website. We offer to contribute to the Eunomia Journal. We want to hear your voices. We want to hear your thoughts on these processes. We have a lot of different mediums. And most importantly, purchase your copy of War and the Art of Governance. That's how I got it. I am terribly sorry. I was just sometimes the wheels spin too much in the old head here. Plus 2 beers also do that. And then also check out our CAA reading list, which Kyle was a major part of putting that together. And this book is on it. And then sign up for the CAA Symposium in October. So we'd really like to have everybody come to the CAA Symposium in October. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and our 1CA podcast. And then most importantly, if you have a chance to do it, we have 2 current writing competitions, one with Divergent Options and Eunomia Journal. We're asking for 1,000 words on what you think the effect of human factors will be on in the paradigm of 2035. And finally, the Civil Affairs Association issue papers, which are due the end of August, in August 28th, actually, to be exact. And tonight, in about 3 hours, you can still contribute to the team room competition and win a Glock. So with that being said, we will be hosting in July, we'll be hosting Jay Parker and Andrew Novos about restoring Thucydides. So we're going to go back to the Peloponnesian War and talk about the roots of both information operations, psychological operations, and grand strategy. And then in August, we're talking to Dr. Monica Duffy Toft, my actual thesis advisor, about her new book on state failure as well as political demography. So I think those are really important conversations to be had that aren't discussed often. So look at this, 8:29 on the dot. Nadia, thank you so much. Any parting comments in your last 1 minute you have with us?
No, I'm grateful to everyone for taking the time, and I really had fun, and it was really enjoyable, got me thinking. And I look forward to reconnecting in the future. So thank you so much.
Definitely. Thank you, and have a great evening. And as always, these will be posted in about 1 week to about 2 weeks on our YouTube channel for anybody that might not have made it here. Everybody have a great evening. Stay safe. And
cheers.
Cheers.
Take care. Are we still on?
We are. I'm stopping.